thank you for being here. So the video is almost over from our interview where I talked your ear off and got to hear your awesome story. And I have your book with me right here, which I've thoroughly annotated and um, just digested. And I'm really excited to hear people's questions and to offer them a chance to talk with you. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. I'm gonna take. I did some media stuff around my report recently, and I've been trying to manage a few things with like Twitter and X and that kind of thing. And I think after this week, I think for December, I'm gonna try and take a step back. I think from a lot of the engagement stuff and just take a
Yeah.
breather and spend December like with my family and yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was actually of the same mind. I was thinking the same thing to take a little break and have it focused on family, and that's a really good idea, I think.
Yeah, I
So
think I need a bit of a break from engaging with it all day, every day.
yeah, it gets exhausting. Sometimes it's just a little bit draining. So anybody that's here, I think we have some people here now on the Q&A. Go ahead and leave
Yeah.
your questions in the chat for Ben so we can really dive into parental alienation and your book and your story and everything related to this abuse. If there are any particular topics you guys would like to talk about, please leave it in the chat. Just go ahead and put any questions in the chat. We're going to limit this to 60 minutes. So Ben is in the UK. It's pretty late there. So we're going to talk for about 60 minutes. And yeah, you guys will have the opportunity to pick someone else's mind other than mine, which is probably really exciting for a lot of people. I know that there was some person who asked in the interview, they said, do you think that your mom was alienated too by your grandparents, or if that was a possibility? And I said, well, you could ask Ben during the Q&A, and I'm not sure what you would think about that.
So sorry, just say that again.
So they asked like whether your mom was alienated by her parents from your dad too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I mean whether we'd call it that, I don't know, because obviously this is about attack on parent-child relationships. But I mean, they basically my mum's parents, my maternal grandparents were very overbearing people. They had a huge hand in my parents' relationship anyway. And then once the illness was diagnosed, they definitely had a really, really big influence and a big impact on that. And, who knows what a lot of those conversations constituted, but I would imagine there was a very I think that the same impression that I was being painted of my father was probably something that they, were saying to her as well. So I definitely think that they just, yeah, were just overly involved, and I think it just became, from what I've been told, I think it just became like a perfect storm, basically, of the illness itself, the demands. I was a very high demand child. Like I was quite bright. I was quite
Yeah.
energetic. I was like, I didn't sleep much. I had colic. Um, so that places. I mean, any parent listening, having a baby is hugely stressful anyway. And then if you have a high demand child as well, that's really really stressful. Plus my mum's reaction to the illness, my dad's reaction to the illness, and then my grandparents' influence. I think all of that. I mean, I'm actually amazed they stayed together as long as they did until I was 4. From what I've heard, I would have expected it to have finished earlier. But
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
it's
Sorry, we have a comment or a question. Tammy says, I've held off on purchasing the book, but will definitely be purchasing it. I have 2 sons. One is still very enmeshed and entwined. He's 26, has never been out of the household, and toxicity is normal. I'm hearing from more and more parents where one of their children is no longer alienated, but one of them is. And I know that you were an only child, right? By from your parents directly, but then you have step siblings who
Mm,
are
mm,
you consider. It seems like you consider
yeah,
very close. And
yeah.
speaking about what Tammy just said, I do think it inevitably affects your sibling relationships. It really,
Mm.
really can.
Yeah, I mean, so I have two things to say about that. One is about what we know about siblings generally, and the second thing is about my journey with my siblings. So the first thing about siblings in general, we actually don't have a lot of research on siblings and how siblings within the same household where an alienator is operating, um, what happens. Now, I went to the uh, Parental Alienation Study Group conference in June,
Mm.
and I led a family panel at that event, where I gave a presentation about my own experiences, and then there were other people there. We had a mother and daughter, a father and daughter. We had two sisters who were talking about their experiences.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing was going into that session, my assumption, because of the lack of evidence, my assumption had always been that if you are in a household where an alienator is operating, then all of the siblings will be the same. They'll either all be alienated or none will.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not the case, from what I have heard from a lot of the siblings that I've spoken to, is that actually what will happen is usually a alienating uh, parent will choose a favorite that they will alienate, and then the other one, they won't target as much. So actually, you often end up with relationships that are differential. So it will be one will align with the alienated parent because they're not being alienated, and one will align with the alienator. So I think it's actually much more common than we maybe realize for children who grow up in the same house to have very different relationships with both of the parents or two of the parents, and that can happen in a kind of normal, quote unquote, normal household, where there will be slight indications of, siblings that, children might get along with one parent or the other, or be similar to one parent or the other. And, in my household, which is, I hope, not a toxic household, but we definitely have slight areas of more or less alignment with our children, etc. But with alienators, part of the way that they operate, I think, is to try and break down that unit, as well. So that I think is really interesting, and it needs a lot more exploration. In terms of relationship with my siblings, obviously, none of my step or half siblings, belonged or had any interaction with that side of the family, but it still affected our relationship. And I think some of them it's made stronger, some of them it's maybe challenged at times. I know, for example, my stepsister and I are, my she's younger than me, but she's my oldest one out of the three. So she's 3 years younger than me. So I call her my older younger stepsister. So my older younger sister, we are exceptionally close, and I think that's because she grew up with me seeing the effect on me of all of this stuff.
Oh
So
wow.
actually, we draw great strength from each other because we kind of trauma bonded over everything that happened. And then my younger siblings, who are kind of a decade younger than me, um, I think there's potentially an element of distance there because they don't really know a lot about all of that time and everything that happened. And, you know, they actually grew up with very different parents as well because
Mm.
a decade had gone by. When my brother and sister were born in 2001 and 2002, that was, nearly 5 years after the case had ended, and they were so much more distant from it than when they were raising me and my sister at aged 8 and 5, when it was really fresh in the thick of it. So I think that, it's potentially a blocker on our relationship because they don't understand as much about what we went through. So I think it's really important that we consider child on child relationships, and sibling relationships within a home where an alienator is operating, for sure.
Yes. Yes. Wow. I see. I thank you for saying that. I thought that when an alienator targets only one child, I thought that that was more rare because that's what happened to
Mm,
me. My brothers weren't targeted, it was just me. But
yeah.
yeah, there's so many ways that it seems like the alienator naturally just doesn't want the kids to be closer to each other than they are to them, to the alienator
Mm,
themselves. Okay, if
mm.
everybody could go ahead and leave your questions in the chat. I'm sure Ben would love to hear some questions. Also, I would encourage anyone who hasn't gotten Ben's book yet to make sure and do so. It's the perfect resource to loan to anyone in your life who needs to know about parental alienation. Um, but sibling relationships, yeah, that's definitely an area where I would love to see some
Mm.
research done.
And I saw Tammy has said the golden child changed in our situation. Once the oldest started to see things for what they were, the focus changed to the other son, and now he's working on breaking the brotherly bond. And I think that's really interesting as well, because I think alienating parents, because they are frequently operating from a position of needing their own attachment issues fulfilled and their own emotional needs fulfilled, I think they will specifically, it seems to be the case that they specifically target whichever child they believe will A, fulfill those needs, but also be susceptible to the abuse. And it's a very similar, it's a similar argument we make for any kind of pattern of abusive behavior, whether it's adult on adult, adult on child, whatever, any arena. We know that perpetrators do target their abuse, and they do target individuals who they believe that their abuse will be effective on. You know, people who are in controlling coercive relationships, they tend to try and find people, for example, that have low self-esteem, um, who, you know, will fall victim. Now, if you think about this kind of sibling progression, the simplest way that you can judge whether someone is going to fall for your abusive patterns is their age. So the simplest way to make that judgment is the younger the child, the more susceptible they are. So if you have chosen a child that you're targeting and they, what I call age out, if they age out of their
Mhm.
abuse, and start to realize things, then the natural progression, even if it wasn't your first choice, is then to gravitate towards the second child because they're younger. So I think, you know, people, it is tough to kind of say blanketly, because there are all sorts of motivations for alienating behavior, as we know, as is covered in the book. Um, but those who are doing it with malicious intent definitely have choices, you know, around that they make. Um, and those who aren't, maybe those choices are subconscious and they gravitate towards different individuals. But I definitely think, regardless, we need to study a lot more about we need, when we do these studies, because often what they are is they're done as either targeted parents or targeted children. We need to be looking at a family dynamic, so trying to assess where we can the whole family unit and say, okay, what's going on here, and you know, who's got, put your hand up if you've got residual attachment trauma. Okay, this is, you know, all that kind of thing. Try and do a family unit assessment, and that's what they try and do when it gets to family courts. But by that point, as we know, it's often too late to salvage anything.
So, I have a question, and if you guys go ahead and leave your questions in the chat box, we'll get to your questions. But in the meantime, um, I also wanted to talk and ask you about anything that you know from your research or things you've learned in the professional field about alienators ever taking responsibility, or you know, when you confront your alienating parents. I've met a lot of people who've been through this as children now, and it seems as if across the board, in confronting their alienating parent, not only has the parent refused to take any accountability, responsibility, or to apologize, but they go the extra mile in blaming the child and actually sometimes wanting the child to apologize to them. And I've seen this with friends recently. I've seen this with
Yeah.
myself last year, and it's. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Like, do you think that some of these alienators actually do know what they've done and they're just refusing to own up, or do you think they're so delusional that they can't see the harm they've caused?
Mm. So I don't. So the first thing I would say is, and I don't want this to come across as something that is, you know, too negative or depressing, but sadly, all of the people that I've spoken to in the practitioner space, so those who actually deliver interventions, And I got to speak to a lot of those types of people at the PASG conference in June. Sadly, the overwhelming message is of that you've described, is that alienators, they're almost impossible to convince, illuminate, uh, you know, show to them that they have caused harm. And like you said, often it is doubling down, etc. And even where they will then, even though they've spent all of this time alienating the child from the other parent and enmeshing their relationship with them, I've heard stories where that parent will be so offended and have this kind of wound, in some cases, depending on the personality, this kind of narcissistic wound, that they will actually then sever the relationship with the
Yeah.
child they've spent so long alienating, because
Yeah.
they're so they suffer this such deep primal wound that they could be accused of such a thing in this kind of grandiose way of saying, how dare you, almost. And it's interesting because we see this to varying degrees when we bring, for example, when we have individuals not of alienating parents, but just of regular parents, if we try and, for example, redress intergenerational trauma of any kind, where we kind of go back upwards and say, well, actually, this thing that you did, it upset me. A lot of parents, especially from the generation that are trying to do it now, so those kind of silent generation parents or boomer parents, will react really negatively to those kind of conversations. And that's a generational thing, that's a lack of awareness thing, it's all of these things. Whereas I feel that hopefully this generation, or this chunk of people, anyone born hopefully between, say, 1980 and 2000 and beyond, are going to hopefully have enough general knowledge in their wheelhouse, so that, for example, if my son comes to me one day and says, look, you did this thing and it really upset me, I hope that my response will then be, I'm really sorry that that upset you, and I understand that you are hurt by that, and I hope that you understand that I would never mean to do that. But I acknowledge your fear. Those kind of conversations that we're hopefully having more of now. And then when you think about it for an alienator, often there are several issues potentially at play in terms of a cluster B personality type, immense intergenerational attachment wounds and trauma, or even simply relationship based trauma where they feel in this place of such betrayal and vengeance and hurt. With all of those groups of people, once you commit to a position, those are exactly the type of people that will dig and go and go and go and go down. There is nothing that you can say often that will then bring them back to a position of logic, to a position of rationality, etc. So that is a very difficult thing for me to say, because I acknowledge that if people are hearing that and they are alienated children and they think maybe I'll be able to convince them or to talk to them, that's tough to hear. If you are an alienated parent and you're hoping that you can talk the alienator around, I think this makes the case for why we need to start having this conversation as an early intervention conversation. Because the sad facts are, and again, we always need more research on this, but I had it in my case. I've spoken, because these people, I mean, a lot of these people involved in my case, I mean, they died believing all of this, they died believing all of this narrative. And the one person that remains, I mean, and I talked about him, at length in the interview, my uncle, I can't see a way that I'll be able to talk to him or convince him, or he still despises my dad, despises him, and
Yeah.
that's still difficult for me. So yeah, sadly, no. But what I would then say is the lesson is we need to start a lot earlier with all these things. But yeah, it's sad, I'm afraid.
I agree with you completely, and it's almost it's the worst invalidating and gaslighting that
Yeah.
I've ever received. But I was also curious. By the way, I know that we have people here watching. I know that you guys have questions. Please just leave any questions. There's no wrong or right questions. Just put them in the chat.
And just to stress from my side, I mean, if you've heard anything in the interview that was personal, you want me to expand upon at all, I mean, I feel like I laid a lot out there in the interview, and I've always been very clear that I'm kind of quite happy to talk about my story. And like I said, after this week, I'm going to go on a December long kind of hiatus anyway. So don't worry about me getting triggered or upset or anything, because it doesn't tend to happen. And also, if I do, I've got a break after this anyway. So I'm more than happy to talk about it. And I just want to, now I think my personal and professional goal is to just use my, as yours is, Maddie, is to use my experience for good, hopefully, and to try and educate and to clarify a lot of the time for people, because we've had someone on the chat for the interview that clearly has a misrepresentation potentially of what we're talking about, because I noticed that individual said, well, I know that X, Y, and Z can happen. And I read that and thought, well, you've just described PA, so I don't know what I don't know what the issue is here. But yeah, so but thanks for the comment that we're both awesome that I've just seen. Appreciate that.
Yeah, Jacqueline's awesome. I've reached out to so many people who either believe parental alienation doesn't exist, or they want it to be called something else, or whatever it is, but nobody will debate me or even talk
Mm,
to me except for through this keyboard,
yeah, yeah,
and I've been just wanting to have a discussion with people, because it's my hope that if people can learn more about it, they can see that it absolutely is a real form of abuse,
mm,
and at the same time, exploiters are exploiting it in court. That doesn't mean it
yeah.
doesn't happen though.
But
um
I've always been very, very clear. I mean, I've written, I don't know how many blogs I've written, how many tweets or X's, I don't know what we call them now, how many tweets that I've put out. I don't know how many times I've spoken at conference, laying out that position crystal clear of saying, you know, this is a real phenomenon. It's backed up by a wealth of scientific research. But I also don't disagree, just like you said, that it's misused. The answer to that, though, is more education, not to pretend it doesn't exist. And I've laid out that position hundreds of times. I've reached out to those, say, for example, the prominent voices in the UK who are against PA, and I just get stonewalled. And I think it's just very interesting that people who claim to, I don't want this to sound catty, but I think it's very interesting how people who claim to be so virulently opposed to any form of abuse is willing to say to my face that my victimization isn't valid based
Amen.
on their metrics. So I'm like, okay, I don't really see how you marry that up. How do you say, yeah, I'm against abuse, I hate abuse, oh, but you're saying you're abused, well, I don't believe you, or you're wrong. I mean, it's really offensive. It's actually really offensive,
Yeah.
especially as an academic. Not that anybody's expression, if they feel that they've been abused, is valid, but I also have the added layer that, like, I'm a professional in this space. I know what abuse looks. I'm not an idiot. Like, I know what abuse looks like, and I've been able to apply that framework to my own abuse. And they turn around and go, "No, no, you weren't abused, or you're just, or worse." And I had this literally 3 days ago, where people were saying, "Well, you're an apologist for rapists and abusers, and you're pro contact with rapists and abusers, and that kind of thing." And I'm just like, "Whoa, this is why I'm taking a break in December."
Yeah, yeah, it can get crazy. Okay, thank you guys. We have some questions. So Rizanon says, often there are feelings of hurt that the targeted parent didn't do more. Are there tips for what targeted parents should be doing for their children through the different stages of alienation?
Yeah, so I think there is a kind of, you know, phrase that I would put to this instead of specific actions, but I think it's, a consistent demonstration of love and safety. So that's what I would say as a phrase, a consistent demonstration of love and safety. Now, you might say, how do I demonstrate that I love a child and will keep them safe if I'm banned from seeing them, if there's a court order in place, etc.? Because you can show and you can save up, write them letters
Mm.
and date them, get them birthday cards. And I know it's painful. And I do not say any of this lightly. And I know you guys know that. And I know it's painful to have birthday cards that you keep and you never give. But if that child ever does age out and says, why didn't you do more? You can then present all of this stuff to them, because one of the great wounds that I hold is, and it wasn't his fault, but my dad doesn't have any of that memorabilia now. That was because it was stolen from him and burned by my maternal grandmother, so there's not much you could do about that. But
Wow.
it yeah, she really was not all there. But it really, it still hurts me that I don't have what I view to be the normal artifacts that children
Yeah.
should have. And I go home to my wife's family home, and her bedroom is still a shrine to her existence. And I get not everybody's going to have this, but it's still, it's like, oh, every time I go home and there's every stuffed toy and everything. So going back to the original question, yeah, I would say you just need to provide as much as you can, whenever you can, a consistent demonstration of love and safety, that you are a loving and safe parent. The way you choose to do that, I think, is up to you. And I would always advise, as frustrating as it is, always operate within the parameters of the law as has been set in your situation, because if you don't, it will make it worse. But um, do things like buying gifts, getting cards, writing letters. Some people, a really nice idea that I saw was, some people set up an email address,
Yeah.
and they email that email, and then if the child ever comes to them, they give them the password, and they can see how many emails that they've sent them over the years, which I thought was a really, really lovely,
Yes.
more modern way of keeping letters and things. And I've seen people do that in other situations where they're not alienated, where they just set one up for their kid and they give it on their 18th birthday. But a similar kind of thing. So that would be my advice, because you just want to keep demonstrating that, so that when you do hopefully have the opportunity
Mhm.
in person, you can then demonstrate that yourself. You can turn up to a contact visit and show that you're a loving, safe parent, and you're not some maniac as you've been portrayed to be. But if it's the case that you have maybe a longer separation, or a long lost child that comes to you, and has that anger behind, um, you can show that. And I also think a huge part of that is acceptance and acknowledgement, because it's no good in doing that to then say this shows your feelings are invalid, because they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Because you can show that you wanted to be a consistent and loving parent, but also acknowledge that you weren't able to be, and that's still going to be a wound for the child. So I think pairing those things together, of acknowledging and accepting and showing that consistent love, because the good news is that attachment systems are really responsive across the life course. So it doesn't it can often not take a lot of contact to start to build things again. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is the hopeful message. That's the hopeful message.
Yeah.
Is because often you can sit, you can sit down, and you say, if you was that what happened with you?
Yeah, it's been like, I've accessed that love that I have from my dad before everything happened, and it's happened naturally, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Mm,
Moving on to the next question, because we're getting some questions now,
yeah, go for
is
it.
would you homestyle gravy, would you consider recording the book for Audible? Hmm. You have a great
Oh.
speaking voice, and it would make things more accessible.
um, Yeah, I could look into it. Yeah, for sure. I would. I mean, I would happily do that. I have no problem doing that. I just need to look at the mechanisms. But yeah, for sure. I don't know. I've never thought about my speaking. Maybe that's because. Maybe it's the British thing.
And maybe,
The British.
probably. Scale RC says, my court defined alienator denies that she's alienated and now says that you alienated yourself. Is this a usual response? Thanks to both of you for all you're doing.
Hmm.
Blaming the targeted parent, I guess, for being alienated. Do you see that happen?
Yeah, and that's a classic kind of and it's interesting because this acronym is often used against the alienated parent rather than the alienating, but the kind of Darvo tactic,
Mhm.
that I can't remember it because I get so frustrated by it,
Deny.
but
Yeah, I don't know.
deny and reverse the
Yeah,
victim offender.
yeah.
Um, and I think that is a classic kind of uh, deflection. I think any case like that, I would want to, you know, this is why I think it's really important. For example, if you are involved in a court case,
Mm,
or you think that you're experiencing alienating behavior, is to document. I think that's a really important thing, and I said that in my book about the practical advice is to just document, because if you feel like something is going that way or you're in a legal process, I think that is key, because that timeline will often provide clarity over whether because the facts of the matter are, if you're estranged, so if you've done something, if you've left for 3 years, not had any communication with the child, and that was your decision, and then you come back, and the child doesn't want to, have anything to do with you. No, of course you can't claim that you've been alienated.
yeah.
What we often see though is that it will be in a case where yes, there's clear alienation that's occurred, but it's a way of kind of spinning and saying, well, you did this and you did that. And I think a lot of it is focused on a conversation we need to have about what it means to be a safe and good enough parent. Because just as you can spin, often people have argued, which I don't agree with because we have very robust measurements, but people have argued that you can spin anything as alienating behavior. I would say the same is in family court. I mean, you can spin anything as terrible parenting that justifies alienation. It's about getting those thresholds right, because if I lose the plot with my kids and shout at them, does that mean that I'm not a safe parent? Does it mean that I'm an abusive parent? In court, anything can be spun. I could
Mm,
probably be made to look like an absolute, monster. And that's what a lot of the court process does, because by that point, A, that's the job of the solicitors, barristers, lawyers, whatever we're going to call them. And B, people genuinely start to kind of believe those own narratives because it's all they've been hearing. So I think it's just about getting proper assessment with good evidence and good timelines. I think that will always kind of hopefully guard against those kind of situations.
that's a really good point. Um, I have a question here that says, Sarah says, I find the process of finding a therapist who understands parental alienation for my kids overwhelming and risky. Do you have any advice? I'm in the UK.
Did the person say they're in the UK?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is a really good question. Um, I I would recommend. I would probably recommend emailing me so that I can ask, because essentially we have different levels of counsellors within the UK and the professionals. So most and one of the things I want to do is to start education within the BCAP, which is the British Chartered of Counselling Psychologists, or BCAP or something like that, is to get more education, because I think if you're gonna walk into a therapist and say, I need help with parental alienation, I think a lot of them aren't going to know what you're talking about, or um, you know will potentially have been educated in a way that denies that as a pseudoscience, which is unfortunate, and it's something we're working on within the section. I think if you walk in and you talk about things in looser terms, attack on parental relationship, I think most therapists would understand that. So I think my advice would be, start with the body, the accrediting body. So go to the BCAP website. I would search for broader terms like family, family trauma, family relationship difficulties, and things like that. And I think if you actually then describe the behaviors without getting, mired in the terms of PA, etc., then that will probably work. And then, of course, if you're getting on well with that therapist, you can always point them towards my book and say, you should read this book, because we think this is what's gone on. But I hope that in the future I can give a better answer where I can say, yep, everybody within the BCAP is trained on PA, and you can go to any one of them. And that's what I hope, maybe in 3 or 5 years' time I can achieve, or try and achieve. And the good news is that the head of the counselling section of the British Psychological Society, Sue Whitcomb, is, she's on board with it, and she knows that it happens because she's a family court expert. So we hope to get there, but my advice would be go and talk about the behaviors and the impact, and any counselor should be able to help you with that. And then if you feel that you're getting on well with them, maybe orient them towards the book or some key papers and say, do you think this sounds like what's been happening? Yeah.
That makes sense to me. I've seen a lot of parents. There's a big need, it seems, for a list of preferred providers. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
but I see another question here from Stephen T. Are we missing an important piece of the puzzle in not researching grandparents? Could PA be transgenerational, similar to IPV? It definitely is in my family. Yeah. What do you think,
Yeah.
Ben?
Well, I mean, my if someone was to say to me, why does alienation happen? I would say to you, attachment trauma from the generation above. So it is for me, it is fundamentally an intergenerational issue. And I think it's very, I would imagine, and again, this is me just spitballing, this isn't based in the evidence because we need more evidence on this intergenerational idea. And the reason that's so difficult is because it's hard to get family systems that go, yeah, we all agree that we're alienators and it's been transferred down. But my guess is, when you look at the behaviors that are enacted, they are representative of people who have insecure attachment styles and systems. So when you then say, well, where do those attachment systems come from? Well, the blueprint is most often laid by primary caregivers in the upbringing. And you said it was the same in your case, was the same in my case, because it came from, and in my case, it was very visual. It was very clear to see because the grandparents were very active players
Yeah.
in it. But from the study that I did with the men last year, the study I did the year before with the men on PA, many of them did mention other actors on the mother's side, coming in and saying certain things. Obviously, it was on the mother's side because they were all men, but could be on either side. So I think we need a lot more discourse around this and research in the sense that maybe when we do get hold of alienating parents, we need to ask them about their family histories and what their upbringings was like. And I've seen, again, people that maybe not on the alienation side of things, but just generally when, for example, a child feels wounded or has a childhood trauma in some way and then takes it back up, you can often see it's transferred down. So yeah, I mean that's how those patterns are passed down. That's how we develop our sense of safety and security in the world, is through how it's translated down. So yeah, I would say it's absolutely an intergenerational thing, and we need more on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Since we don't have too much time, about 20 more minutes, I see all of your wonderful comments, and I'm sure that we will read those, and Ben will probably read those after. But I'm gonna just stick to questions right now. Kelsey Green.
All of the comments are popping up on my phone,
Oh,
so I do see them. And
you see them? Okay,
yeah, so
awesome.
thanks for all the comments.
We're
Yeah.
reading the comments, but I'm going to address the questions. So Kelsey Green says, what are some of the pros and cons about telling your child they're alienated? How does the child's age play into it? Oh, this is something that really, I can see both sides of the issue. I'm eager to hear what you have to say about this, because I don't think there's any other type of abuse where we don't tell the child, this is wrong.
Well, first of all, hi Kelsey. Love Kelsey. Saw him recently in Toronto, and I'm glad he's joined. So shout out to Kelsey. Um, yeah, I think it's very very tricky because I think in telling a child that they are alienated, you are obviously then implying something negative about the alienating parent, in which case that person could turn around to you and say you're engaging in the same behavior because you're bad mouthing the other parent. Now, don't get me wrong, there's obviously clearly moral line to be drawn between which one of those is being done for the right or wrong reason. So I would always orient the targeted parent back to the central message of consistently showing that you are a loving and safe parent. So rather than specifically challenging something that the other parent has said, bad mouthing the other parent, or telling the child that they are, suffering from a form of abuse, all of these kind of things, I think I would try as much as possible to turn the behavior, turn the focus back to you, and to say, so say the child says something like, "Oh, mummy says this about you." The way you shouldn't respond is, "Well, your mum's a liar." I'm just using mum as an example. The parent's a liar, etc., and really bad mouthing and focusing on the same behavior. You would say something like, "Oh, I'm sad to hear that about me, and that must have made you feel maybe confused. Do you feel that way?" And depending on what they say, if they say no, you could say, "Well, I'm glad to hear that, and that's because of this, blah blah." If they say yes, you feel that way, you say, "Well, you know, look at us right now. Do you feel unsafe now? Do you feel like I don't love you now?" And just explore things with the child from the child's perspective, rather than getting wrapped up and dragged into the parent's behavior, and keep the child focused away from challenge. Because the other thing to say is that it can often be a risk to the child to challenge the behavior. It
Mhm.
may not actually be in their best interest to challenge the behavior. And this will be age dependent, but especially for young children, because you wouldn't say, if a person was physically abusing a child, you wouldn't say to them, "Oh, the best course of action is to fight back," because
Right,
that places that child at greater risk.
right.
And it can be just as damaging with, if you've got, for example, a raging, narcissistic parent who is alienating. It can be really dangerous for that child if you say to them or encourage them to challenge that behavior. It can place them in a position of harm. So again, I would say, rather than getting them to say, "Well, tell your mother she's wrong," blah blah blah, blah, just focus on you, focus on your behavior and your relationship with the child, and just get them to explore and teach them to think critically for themselves, so that when they are sat in that house and they have an alienator saying something towards them, they don't necessarily have to challenge it, but they have the critical thinking skills to sit there and just think, "I'm going to block this out because I don't believe it." So it is something that has to be really sensitively tackled. And I hope that that kind of made sense and was helpful in terms of a piece of advice.
That's really good advice, I think. Um, I do you think there's ever an age, like once the child is an adult, for example, and if they come to you, if the child comes to you asking questions, I remember doing that last year with my dad. He was still really hesitant to tell me anything. He didn't want to put my mom in a negative light at all. Um, but I think some parents have. There's really no right or wrong answer in my mind about this particular issue. Um,
So what was there a question?
yeah, someone said in the case that so someone said in the case I do have a person the child trusts to introduce them to this concept. Do you think
Oh,
it
okay.
is more effective for someone to introduce the concept to the child who is, say, for example, a trusted family member other than the targeted parent?
I think again, it depends on a lot of factors, and it can end up backfiring. And I
Yeah.
think it's something that needs to be tackled really sensitively, because what that can seem like and what that can then be portrayed as to the alienator is that there's now a web of people that are against them, and that are trying to paint them in a bad light. So it can end up, you've got to think about it in, if we scale everything to physical abuse. If someone is like, that they're ready to pop off at any moment, you wouldn't go up and poke them, you wouldn't go up and taunt them, and you wouldn't go up and kind of get people to challenge them. You would try and manage that behavior. So I think it's similar for this type of abuse. And I think, again, any intervention that would be made by another family member would be with the focus that I outlined for the alienated parent. So focusing on the alienated parent, their relationship with the child, and reinforcing the idea that they're consistent and safe and loving, rather than going in and challenging and saying, "Your parent is telling you something that's wrong, or is doing this, blah blah blah." but you can still do that by engaging them in critical thinking, saying, well, do you feel that way? Do you think that your parent, acts that way? Do you feel that way when you're around them? Those kind of probing questions that actually get the child thinking for themselves. And again, it may be that they're just simply not at the age to even begin to engage with that. And I would say, you know, below 7, a lot of it is just about managing, keeping everybody safe. I don't think below 7, you shouldn't really be trying to get the child to do anything, think anything, because they're not there. They can't. For any child developmental theory, like Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, up till 7, because you've got to think about the child up till 7 is still dealing with logic fallacies, like, do things float? They're not in a position to then go on and be like, oh, how do I assess the dynamic in my parents' relationship? I think when you get to that pre-pubescent, 7 to 12, and then obviously the teenage years, that's when you can start having those conversations in a more extended way. But, you can still do it to a certain extent with a child under 7, just really, really light touch. I think the most frustrating thing for alienated parents is sitting back and not making things worse, because you're coming from a position where you're thinking, yeah, but every second that goes by, I'm being challenged and losing the relationship with the child. But it's very clear that if you don't do it in the right way, it can actually swing far the other way and end up reinforcing everything. So it's really, really tricky. And again, not helpfully, but we need to move towards early intervention rather than anything else. But
Yeah, I agree.
it's tricky,
Um,
tricky, tricky, tricky.
yeah. Jacqueline says, what's your advice on how to help a previously alienated child, saying that I'm the type of person to keep things bottled up, I'll figure things out myself? She adds, for me personally, as a previously alienated child, it has helped me tremendously to talk and connect with other survivors. What can we do to help survivors process and feel more comfortable?
I guess things like this and the work that Maddie's doing. I mean, I think there a lot of the focus has been on alienated parents who are alienated now and can talk about their experiences. I think we do need to make that transition to making our voices and our experiences more widely shared, more available. Doing this is why I'm always happy to do things like this and to help promote and run events and that kind of thing and write the book, because I think that's the way, is to make it less stigmatized. Because like you said, an interesting thing is when you say, have you been alienated, often people will say no. When I give lectures, so not necessarily the same as your college intervention, but just when I give lectures about the topic and I start off, I say it was parental alienation and I don't see any reaction. And then I say, well, it's where a parent will target the relationship between the child and the other parent, and it often happens in divorce. I will see, at minimum, in any classroom I'm in, 3 or 4 heads like nodding, going, oh, yeah. And I've had people come up after and be like, oh my gosh, that happened to me. So I think it's just making it more well known, having a good, like, societal understanding about what this looks like,
Yeah.
and to have that as part of our conversations about how we manage separation better generally, because I think we have such a breeding ground for PA,
Mm-hmm.
because especially in the UK, for example, when a couple splits up, there is no system of any kind there to assist them in that at all, to help with any of those issues. We leave people who are very hurt to try and figure things out. And we then act surprised when it so often goes wrong. And I think in our stereotypes, I would bet that a lot of people don't think it's that bad to badmouth your partner, especially if they've done something wrong. And even in front of children, I think a lot of people might feel that way. So I think we just need to have bigger conversations about how important it is in any given situation, intact or post separation, to orient towards the child, what's best for them,
Yeah.
um, and to kind of deal with that. But it is difficult. And there was a quote at a conference I was at recently, and I can't remember the exact words, so you have to forgive me, but it was something along the lines of, there are no two people where it's more difficult to have a conversation than two people who once thought they could tell each other everything. And I
Um,
think it's such a powerful representation of the potential kind of bitterness, acrimony, and distance that people have post separation that makes it hard to think about how to do things best for the child and the barriers there. So, yeah, I think that to me really it kind of knocked me off my chair when I read it because I was like, that's such a good representation of how distant people can become. But yeah,
yeah. Um, I everything you've said seems really logical and important to me, personally. Someone Dan says, how often do you think alienation begins and takes place before the family breaks up? And I mean, that's definitely how it happened, probably 2 years before my parents got divorced from me. I think
yeah,
more often than not, right? What do you think?
yeah, yeah. I mean, going off the study I just did with the fathers that I worked with across last year, I mean, all of them spoke about this kind of beginnings that happened whilst it was still intact. It was very rare that fathers said, "Yeah, I had a perfectly good relationship and there was no alienation, and then we broke up for whatever reason, and then suddenly I couldn't see my kid." You know, I think a lot of them spoke about this kind of helicopter parenting in the relationship, or controlling contact, or bad mouthing that started beforehand. And I think that makes sense. I think if you have been in a situation where you're lucky enough to have had a really kind of positive relationship, then post separation does present really, really key, opportunities and avenues for that to happen. Um, but yeah, I think again we need more. We always need more. We need more research on that. I mean, my my latest study has shown that it is really prevalent post separation, with between 40 and 60% of separating parents experiencing some form of alienating behavior. But where that began, I mean, I think we've got some of that data, so I have to look into it. But yeah, I would say it's probably the majority that begins before.
So we're gonna wrap up really soon, but let's take one last question. Daniel Peterson says, follow-up question. My girls are 15 and 13, and they have now shut me out completely. Do you have advice for reintegration? I'm preparing to go to court for them again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to give blanket advice because everybody's situation is so different, and everyone's situation is, it's very easy to say, yeah, go to court. Some people can't afford court, or, do X and do Y. I think um, I would make sure you're maintaining all of that evidence that you are a safe, loving parent. So maintaining all of that, buying the cards, writing the letters, sending the emails, etc., and things like that. Um, and the one thing I would say is keep the faith,
Yeah.
because sadly, what I'm seeing in my work that I do specifically with fathers is that a lot of men, it becomes too much and they engage in suicide. Um, and that is less prevalent for women, but women experience extreme mental health difficulties as well, but particularly for fathers. And I've looked at it in an academic context. I've spoken to my dad about it, which was one of the more difficult parts of our conversation about how low he got when he was fighting for me. And I've also engaged with members of the general public who reach out to me as a PA advocate on Twitter and talk about their experiences. And I've talked someone down on X from suicide, because they think I'm just, what's the point? I'm never going to see it. And I think my overriding message is keep the faith. If you've got children who are 15 and 13, hopefully they're quite close to aging out. Often when children hit 18, depending on their choices and things, sometimes a really key moment is if they leave the family home, if they go to university, when they stop having that constant input, they start to question. And I would just say, hang in there, keep up the evidence. And if you're in a position to go to court and to make that case, then that's what the mechanism is there for. But just also make sure you take care of yourself, whilst you're doing any of this stuff. Um, but I'm hopeful, and I hope that it ends well.
And what is, have you found in your research why that is? Why more fathers are more likely to commit suicide than,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So we explored it a lot in the report from last year, and we found. So we looked at, for anybody who hasn't read the report, it's called Lost Dads. So if you just type in Lost Dads UWL, it should come up. Um, we did a case review of 1,000 fathers' case files who sought help from a charity, and 40% of them answered yes to the question, have you struggled with suicidal thoughts in the last 12 months? 40%. Um, so if you apply that 40% figure to and we can work out how many men get divorced in the UK based on
Mhm.
the stats that we have. As the most conservative estimate I can give, because that's just looking at divorces and it's just based on the fathers that have sought help, that's about 11,000 men year on year in the UK that are actively suicidal following separation. Um, so it's huge, and we explored why that was, and a lot of this links to general negative stereotypes and stigma around men's mental health, around reaching out, around masculinity. They have to be stoic, um, and they're the ones that lose the contact. They in the UK, anywhere between, depending on the stats you look at, anywhere between 80 and 95% of the non-resident parents, so the one who leaves the home, is the father. Um, and almost all of the fathers in my study said, you want to know why I'm depressed and I'm suicidal? I don't see my children.
Yeah.
I either don't see them at all or I don't see them enough. And overwhelmingly, mothers don't have that situation, and they're more inclined to seek mental health support anyway. So that would be why, because we take men away from their children, or men leave from their children, and they don't reach out. Oh, I'm really glad to see Daniel commenting saying no shortage of faith. So keep the faith for sure.
Can you say
But yeah, that's why.
can you say the name of your study again? I think I want to look at it, maybe do a video.
Oh yeah, well I'll send it via X as well, but it's just called Lost Dads.
Lost. Yeah.
It's got a longer title, but it's Lost Dads, findings from the Fathers and Family Breakdown, Separation, and Divorce Project. But that's way too long. But if you just type in Lost Dads UWL, which is
Okay.
my institution, University of West London, it will come up. And there's an executive summary which is much more digestible. And then if you really want to get into it, there's the full report with all of the testimony, which is a really tough read. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is what I've been doing a little bit of a kind of media roundabout recently, because of course. Oh, and happy International Men's Day today.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. International Women's Day.
so yeah, I've been tying, because the focus for International Men's Day this year is zero suicide, and I've got a project that says that separated fathers have a high risk of suicide. So I've been speaking with a few people, and it just is really really worrying.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know my own dad didn't seek therapy or anything. He just
No.
moved
I
forward.
mean, my dad has never had any therapy. I mean, he should. He absolutely
Yeah.
should.
Yeah. Same.
Um,
Yeah.
and what I have hoped is that hopefully doing some of this work with me has maybe helped. I hope it's helped a little bit. Um, but he absolutely needs support, but he's never reached out and he never will, bless him. And many men don't, and because they don't think they need to, and all this kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Really
really
sad.
tough.
Really sad. I'm really, really grateful for you participating in my project, letting me interview you, and doing this Q&A. I like to keep the focus on the children
Yeah,
because it's it kind of makes me sick sometimes seeing all these people going after each other's throats about it's a gendered issue.
yeah,
What should we call it? All these different things, and I don't really see many people focusing on how to help the kids, all the damage that's
mm,
being done to the kids, etc. Um,
mm,
and I think that you're a vital piece in this puzzle because not only have you lived through this as a child, but now you're in a professional, and you have that the ability to make real change through your research and now your book. So
So,
thank you so much for being here, and I'm sure
no,
everybody else
thank you.
is hearing from you so much. Hopefully, I can see you in London sometime and get to
Yeah, look forward to it.
yeah. I just want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate your work.
No, thank you, and thanks to everyone who watched and commented. And yeah, if you haven't bought the book, I mean, I don't, I didn't write it to make money, and it doesn't make a lot of money, and that's fine. It's to help people, and so when I say buy it, it's not for me; it's for people who need it. Um, because I am getting good feedback on it. I do think it's a good resource, and I hope that there's some good advice in there as well. So um, and do follow me, follow my work, and yeah, just more than anything else, keep that commitment to hopefully finding a way forward, and just keep showing you're a safe, loving parent, because that's what your child needs. That's what your
Yeah,
child wants, and hopefully, if you stick around, they will get the opportunity to see that with their own eyes. So that's my hope,
yeah.
anyway.
So I want to end by showing them again. It's called Parental Alienation: A Contemporary Guide for Parents, Practitioners, and Policymakers by Ben Hine. I grabbed it on Amazon, and it's a really easy read. It breaks down all the information about parental alienation that you need into a really digestible book. And you can also find Ben on Twitter. Are you on any other social medias, or do you mostly do Twitter?
I do actually have a TikTok, which is
Okay.
at Prof Hine as well, where I post. It's basically exclusively PA content. Don't worry, there's no like dances or anything on there. It's just PA content. I need to post again actually, but yeah, it's mainly those two. Obviously through the uni website, etc. And the other thing, just to say about the book, it says this in the cover, but 10% of all of the proceeds go to PA charities as well.
Oh wow.
I was able to donate recently to two charities in the UK: Dads Unlimited, who work, as the name would suggest, with fathers, and Match Mothers, who work with mothers, both of whom look at alienation. So it's helping a good cause as well.
That's amazing. I missed that part in the cover. I'm glad that you said that.
I'll put it in bold next time. In the next edition, I'll put it in bold. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's 10% proceeds go to charity. So
Well,
yeah,
thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being here today. I hope you have a great
no, no worries.
holiday,
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I
and
will
thank you
do. All
for
right, thanks,
everyone
Maddie. Thanks,
participating.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.